In 1947, 5 Soviet prisoners were sealed inside a gas chamber. They were told, "Stay awake for 30 days and you will be free." But what began as a military experiment soon became something no one could explain. Some say the test was abandoned. Others believe it never ended. This is the story of the Russian sleep experiment and the real Cold War projects that may have inspired it. The Cold War had just begun. The world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were racing to control not just weapons, but minds. Hidden beneath layers of secrecy, both sides ran psychological experiments to push human endurance, to find out what broke a person first, their body or their mind. While the CIA ran Project MKUltra in the West, experiments in hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and drugs, the Soviets had their own rumored divisions. One of them, according to Declassified fragments, was Project N-4. Its goal: to test human resistance to extreme conditions, sleep loss, sensory control, and isolation. The volunteers weren't soldiers. They were prisoners. 5 men promised freedom if they could stay awake for 30 days. Inside a sealed chamber, they were fed through tubes and watched behind one-way glass. Pipes hissed softly, pumping in an experimental gas compound meant to eliminate the need for sleep. At first, everything seemed fine. The men talked, joked, sang old Russian songs. The scientists logged every hour. But on the 5th day, things began to change. Their speech slurred, their laughter turned into whispers. One began pacing endlessly, another sat perfectly still for hours, staring at the steel wall. And then, the voices started. They weren't talking to each other anymore. They were talking to someone else. By the 10th day, the chamber was chaos. Screams echoed through the intercoms, then sudden silence. When the scientists spoke through the microphones, the men refused to answer. They only whispered back, "We are awake." The guards wanted to end the test, but the military supervisors refused. They wanted results, data, and in the Cold War, data was power. As the days went on, sleep deprivation turned to delusion. The subjects began tearing apart their own food packets, then the mattresses, then silence again. The gas kept flowing. When the researchers finally cut the supply and opened the chamber, they expected corpses. But what they found inside was far worse, a scene of madness. The men were alive, barely, their minds fractured. They begged to stay awake. One of them said something that still appears in fragments of old Soviet transcripts: "Sleep is death. We saw what comes after sleep." That quote appears in no verified archive, but it has circulated for decades among Cold War researchers. Its origins unclear. Some believe it was propaganda, others a cover for darker truths. Because around that same time, both the US and Soviet governments were funding research into psychological endurance, hypnosis, and mind control. And documents that were lost or destroyed later appeared in fragments, mentioning continuous wake trials, forced sensory exposure, and autonomic disintegration. Those are scientific terms, but what they describe sounds almost supernatural. If stories like this make you question what really happens behind closed doors, hit subscribe because the next case might be even darker and even more real. Officially, the Russian sleep experiment is fiction. A creepypasta that exploded online in the early 2010s. But what makes it terrifying is how much of it sounds plausible. Declassified MKUltra files confirm that both sides used human test subjects for psychological endurance. Subjects were kept awake for days, dosed with hallucinogens, isolated from light and sound, all in the name of research. No official Russian document titled "Sleep Experiment" has ever surfaced. But stories persist, whispered by retired scientists, Cold War historians, and intelligence officers. They talk about tests in St. Petersburg, gas chambers for consciousness study, subjects who forgot they were human. Maybe it's legend, Maybe it's collective guilt. Or maybe, like MK Ultra, it's one of those truths buried so deep, it survives only in myth. And every myth starts with a seed of reality. When people hear the story of the Russian sleep experiment, they imagine monsters, mutilation, madness. But the real horror isn't what the subjects did, it's what we learned from them. That behind every experiment, every classified file, there's a line humanity is willing to cross, just to see what happens. And maybe that's why this story endures. Because deep down, we know, somewhere in a quiet lab, behind steel doors and white walls, someone might still be awake, watching, recording, waiting to see what happens next.